Let's start today with a moment of silence. Not for the fallen, but for the silence that actually fell over terrorists in January 1919.
When the guns finally stopped.
Right. The quote-unquote war to end all wars was over. And the world basically held its breath because everyone assumed that the hard part, the dying, the trenches, the mud, that it was all finished.
Which is really the great tragedy of the 20th century, isn't it? The assumption that the absence of war is somehow the exact same thing as peace.
Exactly. We tend to look at World War I as this closed book. It ends in 1918. We celebrate Armistice Day, and then we just sort of fast forward to the 1930s when things go wrong again.
But that gap is where the real story is.
Yeah, and that's our mission for today. We're doing a deep dive into that exact gap, specifically into the Treaty of Versailles and the fragile peace of a broken Europe. Because looking at the historical sources we have today, it really seems like the moment the ink dried on that treaty, the countdown clock for World War II started ticking.
I wouldn't even call it a countdown clock. It's more like a fuse. The common narrative you always hear is just that the treaty was harsh. But when you actually read the text and the diplomatic cables from 1919, you realize it was a chaotic, contradictory mess.
They broke the world trying to fix it.
Precisely. And we aren't just talking about Germany here. If you want to understand why the map of Europe looks the way it does today, or why the Middle East is so unstable, or why international diplomacy can go so terribly wrong, you have to look at Paris in 1919.
The scale of this conference was just insane. You had leaders from all over the world descending on Paris. But in reality, the fate of the planet was being decided by three guys in a room who kind of couldn't stand each other.
The big three. And you really can't understand the treaty without understanding the massive personality clash between them. It wasn't just a clash of nations. It was a total clash of worldviews.
So let's set the stage for the listener.
Yeah.
You have the American president, Woodrow Wilson. He arrives in Europe, and by all accounts, he's treated almost like a messiah.
Oh, he absolutely was. There were crowds of hundreds of thousands in Paris cheering for him in the streets. Wilson represented something entirely new, which was American idealism.
Right, he had his famous 14 points.
Yeah, which he had outlined before the war even officially ended. He didn't want territory. He didn't want revenge. He wanted this concept of self-determination.
Meaning the idea that people should choose their own government.
Right. And his crowning jewel was the creation of a League of Nations to ensure collective security. He genuinely, truly believed he could re-engineer human nature to prevent war.
Which sounds great on paper. But sitting across from him is Georges Clemenceau, the Prime Minister of France. And I get the sense from reading his letters that he wasn't interested in re-engineering human nature. He was interested in concrete.
Clemenceau is known as the Tiger for a very good reason. You have to understand his perspective here. Wilson was an ocean away from the fighting. Clemenceau had seen the German army invade France twice in his own lifetime.
Once in 1870 and again in 1914.
Exactly. The war was fought on French soil. Their industry was incinerated. A huge chunk of their male population was just gone. So when Wilson starts talking about a peace without victory, Clemenceau looks at him and essentially says, "That's easy for you to say. You don't live next door to them."
So his goal was security, but a very specific, aggressive kind of security.
Right. He didn't want a handshake. He wanted to break Germany's knees. He wanted them physically unable to ever attack France again.
Which meant demilitarization, massive reparations, and creating a buffer zone in the Rhineland.
Yes. And then you have the third wheel in this dynamic, David Lloyd George of Great Britain.
Where does he fall on this spectrum between world peace and burn it to the ground?
He's the pragmatist, the politician, but he's totally trapped. Privately, Lloyd George was actually really worried. He knew that if you crushed Germany, which was the economic engine of Europe at the time, you would drag the whole continent into poverty.
Including Britain.
Exactly. He famously said he wanted to see Germany punished but not destroyed.
But he had a massive problem back home.
A huge problem. He had just won an election, the khaki election, on a platform that essentially promised to make Germany pay. The British public was furious. They had lost nearly 1 million men.
The press was literally screaming for him to squeeze the German lemon until the pips squeak.
That was the quote. So Lloyd George ends up in this impossible position. He has to act incredibly tough to satisfy his voters, but he's privately trying to be lenient enough to prevent a total European economic collapse.
So you have Wilson in the clouds, Clemenceau in the trenches, and Lloyd George checking the polls. They lock themselves in a room, and the result is the Treaty of Versailles.
A compromise where nobody got what they really wanted.
Let's get into the specifics of what they actually did to Germany. Because the punishment narrative is famous, but the actual details are just brutal. It starts with Article 231.
The war guilt clause.
This is the part that always surprises me. It wasn't enough to beat them on the battlefield. They had to make them sign a confession.
It was a legal necessity for the Allies. See, if you want to charge someone for billions in damages, you first have to establish liability. Article 231 forced Germany, and by extension its allies, to accept full, total responsibility for causing all the loss and damage of the war.
Which is historically highly debatable, right? I mean, Austria-Hungary fired the first shots, Russia mobilized early on. It's a massive domino effect.
Most historians today agree it was a systemic failure of alliances. But forcing Germany to sign this was a public humiliation on the world stage that cut deep into the national psyche.
It wasn't just we lost. It was we are the villains of the world.
And that clause became the psychological catalyst for the rise of fascism later. Plus, it was the legal basis for the reparations.
Let's talk about that, Bill. We hear reparations and we usually think of a fine. But this wasn't just a check they had to write.
No, it was an economic bleed-out. The final figure was set at 132 billion gold marks.
Which is something like $500 billion in today's money.
Roughly, yes. But the crucial part, and this is what really ruined the German economy, was that they didn't just have to pay in cash. They had to pay in kind.
In kind.
Like bartering. Resources. Germany had to ship tons of coal, timber, dyes, and pharmaceutical chemicals directly to France and Belgium. They even had to send livestock.
Wait, livestock?
Thousands of German milk cows were rounded up and sent to France to replace herds that were lost in the war.
So at the exact moment Germany's trying to rebuild its own shattered country and feed its own starving population, the Allies are literally taking the coal out of their factories and the cows out of their fields.
It was completely unsustainable, and it had a massive political cost. The government that signed this treaty was the new Weimar Republic, which was a democracy.
Oh, wow. So by forcing this young democracy to accept these crippling terms, the Allies inadvertently associated democracy with humiliation and poverty in the minds of the German people.
Exactly. You are handing free ammunition to political extremists before the war is even officially cold. And that's before we even touch the military restrictions and land cessions.
Right. The treaty capped the German army at 100,000 men. No air force, no submarines.
For a nation with a deeply proud military tradition, this was totally emasculating. It left them feeling defenseless in a neighborhood where they were surrounded by enemies.
Speaking of the neighborhood, this is the other massive piece of the puzzle here.
Yeah.
The map of Europe looks completely different after this treaty. The Austro-Hungarian Empire is just gone.
The Ottoman Empire is gone.
The Russian Empire has collapsed into a bloody civil war.
It was a massive geopolitical vacuum, and the Allies decided they had to fill it. This is where Wilson's self-determination ran headfirst into French paranoia. They created what we call democratic successor states.
Countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia.
Right, but these weren't just created out of the goodness of the Allies' hearts.
They had a dual purpose, right?
Yes. The French, in particular, had a strategy called the cordon sanitaire, a quarantine line. They wanted a buffer zone. They needed strong states in Eastern Europe to do two things: keep Germany boxed in from the east, and stop the spread of communism from the new Soviet Union.
So they're drawing borders for strategic convenience, not necessarily because the people living there actually want to be a unified country.
That is the fatal flaw of the whole map. Take Poland and Czechoslovakia. To make them strong enough to actually act as buffers, the Allies gave them territory that contained huge industrial resources, but also huge German populations.
So Sudetenland.
Exactly. The Sudetenland was given to Czechoslovakia because it had mountains and fortifications that made it a highly defensible border against Germany. But the people living there were ethnically German.
So you have 3 million Germans suddenly living in a country they don't want to be in.
Ruled by people they often viewed as inferiors. It was a recipe for disaster.
And then there's the Polish corridor.
A classic example of a good idea on paper that was terrible in practice. Poland needed access to the sea to be economically viable, so the Allies just gave them a strip of land leading up to the Baltic Sea.
But that strip of land cut Germany right in two.
Yes, it separated East Prussia completely from the rest of Germany.
I mean, imagine if another country owned a strip of land separating New England from the rest of the U.S. You'd be furious.
It was an open wound. Every time a German citizen looked at a map, they saw their country sliced apart. And it wasn't just Germans who suffered from this. Look at Hungary.
They lost a huge amount of land, didn't they?
The Treaty of Trianon took away 2/3 of Hungary's territory. Millions of ethnic Hungarians ended up living in Romania and Slovakia.
Or Yugoslavia. which literally translates to land of the southern Slavs.
Right. They took Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, Bosnians, groups with entirely different religions and long histories of conflict, and they just forced them all into one single state.
So while Wilson is preaching self-determination on the world stage, the reality on the ground is that millions of people are being told, you're Polish now or you're Czech now, regardless of their actual identity.
It created instant minority problems in almost every single new country. These successor states were fragile from day one because a significant chunk of their own population actively wanted the state to fail.
Okay, so Europe is a mess of resentful minorities and broken economies. But the safety net for all of this was supposed to be the League of Nations. This was Wilson's baby. The idea was if a dispute comes up, we go to the League, we talk it out openly, we don't fight. Why did it fail so spectacularly?
The irony is just painful here. The League was designed by the American president, but the United States never actually joined it.
Because of the Senate.
Right. Henry Cabot Lodge and the Republicans in the U.S. Senate were staunch isolationists. They looked at Article 10 of the League Covenant, which basically said members had to protect each other's independence.
And to them, that sounded like an automatic draft.
Exactly. It sounded like if France gets into a border skirmish, American boys have to go die. They absolutely refuse to ratify the treaty.
So the architect builds the house, but refuses to live in it.
And it gets much worse. Germany wasn't allowed to join initially because they were the bad guys. Communist Russia wasn't allowed to join because they were the scary revolutionary guys.
So you have a global organization trying to keep world peace, but it's missing the world's biggest economy, the biggest potential military threat, and the biggest revolutionary threat.
It's a club with no bouncers. It had absolutely no teeth. And that structural weakness was immediately exploited by the victors, especially regarding the rest of the world outside of Europe. Which brings us to the mandate system.
This is the part of the deep dive that feels like the biggest betrayal of Wilson's ideals. Because self-determination sounded like a universal concept, like it applied to everyone. But when you look at how they handled the Middle East, that is not what happened.
Not at all. And this is vital for understanding the modern Middle East. During the war, the British had actively encouraged the Arabs to revolt against the Ottoman Empire.
There was a specific correspondence, right? The Hussein McMahon letters.
Yes, where the British strongly implied that if the Arabs fought alongside them against the Turks, they would be rewarded with a unified, independent Arab state after the war.
Basically, help us win, and you get your freedom.
That was the pitch. But at the exact same time, behind closed doors, the British and French were signing a secret deal called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. They literally took a map and drew a line in the sand, dividing the Middle East up between themselves.
So when the war finally ends, the Arab leaders show up in Paris expecting independence, and instead they get
the mandate system. The League of Nations officially declares that these populations are, quote, not yet able to stand by themselves. So France gets to take care of Syria and Lebanon, and Britain gets to take care of Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq.
Takes care of B is doing a tremendous amount of heavy lifting there.
It was imperialism in disguise. It was colonialism with a polite, bureaucratic name. And the boundaries they drew were completely catastrophic.
Let's look at Iraq as a case study.
Britain cobbled together 3 completely different Ottoman provinces: Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra. These areas had entirely different ethnicities, like Kurds and Arabs, and different religious sects, Sunni and Shia.
And they were just thrown together into one country.
Not because it made any cultural sense for the people living there, but purely because the British wanted the prodigious amount of oil in Mosul and access to the Persian Gulf in Basra.
And what about in Palestine?
Britain took the mandate for Palestine, where they now had to balance the local Arab population with the promises they had made in the Balfour Declaration regarding a national home for the Jewish people. They were essentially promising the same piece of land to 2 different groups while keeping administrative control for themselves.
So the hypocrisy was just off the charts. Wilson is giving speeches about freedom and democracy, but the European powers are just grabbing oil fields and warm water ports.
It permanently shattered trust in the West. Prince Faisal, who represented the Arabs at the peace conference, felt completely stabbed in the back.
That sense of betrayal is still a major part of the political narrative in the Middle East today, isn't it?
Absolutely. They didn't see the Western powers as liberators or peacemakers. They saw them as hypocrites who broke their promises the second it was economically convenient.
When you lay it all out like this, the total public humiliation of Germany, the incredibly unstable borders drawn in Eastern Europe, the outright betrayal in the Middle East, and a League of Nations with no actual power, it feels far less like a peace treaty and more like a bridge straight to the next global conflict.
That is the general historical consensus today. The headline of Versailles really is the failure of resolution. They didn't solve a single one of the underlying tensions that caused World War I. They just put them all in a pressure cooker and clamped the lid down tight.
They prioritize punishment over stability.
And they prioritized their own imperial resources over the reality on the ground. The economic ruin of Germany made the radical arguments of the Nazis sound plausible to a desperate, starving population.
The isolation of the Soviet Union created the deep paranoia that eventually fueled the Cold War.
And the arbitrary borders drawn in the Middle East created nations that are still actively struggling for internal cohesion today. It was a failure on almost every front.
It really brings up a massive what if for you to think about. We always ask, what if Hitler had been stopped earlier in the 1930s? But looking at these sources, the much better question might actually be, what if the Allies had acted differently in 1919?
That is the most haunting question of the era. Imagine if, instead of Article 231 and crippling financial reparations, the Allies had done something akin to a Marshall Plan after World War II.
Imagine if they had used their resources to rebuild Germany's economy and integrate them into a democratic Europe immediately.
Right, if they had treated the Weimar Republic as a fragile partner that needed support instead of a pariah that needed to be punished.
It's very possible that the sheer economic desperation that fueled fascism never would have taken hold.
The entire 20th century could have looked completely different. Millions of lives might have been saved.
It's a brutal lesson in leadership and statecraft. Winning the war is only half the job. Winning the peace, actually creating a stable post-war world that requires a level of foresight and generosity that was just completely missing in Paris in 1919.
Generosity to a recently defeated enemy is an incredibly hard sell politically, as Lloyd George found out with his voters. But the alternative, as the world found out just 20 years later, is infinitely more expensive.
So here's a final provocative thought for you to mull over as we wrap up this deep dive. If prioritizing punishment over rehabilitation caused so much destruction in the 20th century, do we still punish defeated enemies or even rival nations the same way today? Are we still drawing lines in the sand and hoping for the best?
Something to keep in mind the next time you read the international news.
Definitely. Thank you for helping us unpack this massive historical tragedy today.
My pleasure. Let's just hope we've actually learned the lesson.